People love calling a flood wall ugly right up until it becomes the only reason they still have a home. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the emergency weather alert on my phone shattered the silence with a sharp electronic chime that seemed louder than the thunder rolling across the valley. Outside my bedroom window, rain hammered against the glass so hard it sounded like handfuls of gravel thrown by an angry sky. The air smelled of wet concrete, soaked cedar, and the faint metallic scent that always arrives before a major storm reaches its worst. I stepped onto my back porch with a flashlight, and the beam caught sheets of rain racing sideways in the wind. 30 yards from where I stood, my flood wall stretched across the edge of my property like a silent gray guardian. Water slammed against it with relentless force, sending white spray into the darkness, but the reinforced concrete never moved so much as an inch. Then I heard another sound cutting through the storm. Someone was pounding on my front door. Not knocking, pounding. The frantic rhythm echoed through the house before I even reached the hallway. When I opened the door, Brenda Holloway stood there completely drenched, her designer raincoat plastered against her shoulders, mascara running down her face as water dripped from her hair onto my porch. This was the same HOA president who had spent months telling everyone my flood wall was the ugliest thing our neighborhood had ever seen. The same woman who organized petitions demanding I tear it down because it ruined the community's appearance. The same woman who smiled every time another violation notice appeared in my mailbox. But tonight, her voice was different. It shook. "Ethan, please," she said between heavy breaths. "The water, it's everywhere. You have to help us." Behind her, I could see headlights half submerged beneath muddy water creeping across the subdivision streets. Mailboxes leaned at strange angles. Decorative stone entrances disappeared beneath rising runoff. Lawns that had once looked like golf courses were now connected by a single moving sheet of dark water reflecting flashes of lightning. Somewhere in the distance, a car alarm cried into the storm before suddenly falling silent. My flood wall stood exactly where it had always been, separating my property from the rushing current pouring downhill toward the neighborhood. I looked past Brenda and watched another surge slam into the barrier with a deep hollow boom that vibrated through the ground beneath my boots. Every expansion joint held. Every drainage outlet performed exactly as designed. Every calculation I'd spent years making was now being tested by nature itself. Brenda followed my eyes toward the wall. 3 months earlier, she had stood less than 20 feet from that same structure during an HOA board meeting and laughed while calling it my expensive monument to paranoia. Several neighbors laughed with her. One even suggested painting flowers on it to make it less offensive. I never argued. I simply thanked them for their opinions, folded the engineering reports back into my folder, and drove home. Water doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about popularity contests, neighborhood aesthetics, or HOA bylaws. It follows gravity, physics, and every mistake people make when they believe appearances matter more than preparation. As another flash of lightning illuminated the valley, I realized the storm had finally arrived exactly the way the forecast predicted. What nobody else knew was that this disaster hadn't started tonight. It had started 92 days earlier, in a brightly lit clubhouse filled with people who believed concrete was uglier than common sense. I did not build that wall because I was afraid of water. I built it because I had spent my entire career watching people underestimate it. Long before I bought my house in Maple Ridge Estates, I was a civil engineer specializing in stormwater management across 3 states. My days were filled with drainage models, floodplain surveys, retention basin inspections, and emergency planning meetings that most people considered painfully boring until the day those plans became the difference between inconvenience and disaster. I learned early that nature always keeps perfect records. Every inch of pavement added without proper drainage. Every culvert ignored because maintenance could wait another year. Every shortcut approved to save a few $1,000s eventually appeared on someone else's front lawn as floodwater. Those lessons started even earlier than my engineering career. When I was 12 years old, my father stood beside me during a spring flood on my grandfather's farm in Missouri. We watched muddy water swallow fences that had stood for decades, and I remember asking him why nobody stopped it. He looked across the flooded fields and quietly said, "Son, the river gave everyone plenty of warnings. Most people just decided not to listen." That sentence stayed with me through college, through every engineering license exam, and through every construction project I supervised. When I finally decided to leave consulting and settle down, I spent nearly 2 years looking for the right property. Maple Ridge Estates looked perfect on the surface. Quiet streets, mature oak trees, friendly neighbors, well-maintained homes, beautiful landscaping. But I never buy property by looking at flowers or fresh paint. I asked for elevation maps. I studied historical rainfall data. I reviewed county drainage records going back 20 years. I examined soil reports, storm sewer layouts, and satellite images taken after major storms. The neighborhood sat inside a shallow basin that gently collected runoff from several surrounding hills before directing it toward an aging drainage channel near the eastern entrance. Most buyers would never notice that detail. Engineers always do. The official reports describe the flood risk as manageable under normal conditions, but several recommendations for drainage improvements had been postponed year after year because they were considered too expensive. That was all I needed to know. Before I unpacked my first moving box, I hired a geotechnical firm to perform additional soil testing. Then I submitted detailed construction plans for a reinforced flood barrier designed specifically for my lot. Every drawing met county requirements. Every permit was approved after multiple inspections. The wall was not enormous or dramatic. It stood just under 5 feet high at its tallest point and curved naturally with the slope of the property to redirect excess water toward an approved overflow channel. Hidden beneath the landscaping were drainage pipes, pressure relief openings, reinforced footings, and an emergency spillway designed to activate only under extreme conditions. It was never intended to stop an entire flood. It was designed to guide water exactly where physics wanted it to go without allowing it to destroy my home. When construction finished, I stood quietly in my backyard one evening listening to birds settle into the trees while fresh concrete cured beneath the fading summer sun. I remember thinking the wall would probably never become important. Honestly, I hoped it would spend decades doing absolutely nothing. Unfortunately, some people noticed it long before the first storm ever did. The first complaint arrived 9 days after construction crews packed up their equipment. It was folded neatly inside an envelope with the familiar blue HOA logo printed across the top, informing me that an architectural review had determined my newly completed structure was visually inconsistent with the community's character. The letter politely requested that I remove it within 30 days to avoid additional action. I read it once, smiled to myself, placed it inside a folder with my permits, and went back to watering the young maple trees I had planted along the inside edge of the barrier. A week later, another letter arrived. Then another. Before long, I received an invitation to attend the next monthly HOA board meeting. I decided to go, not because I expected agreement, but because engineers solve problems with facts, and I assumed facts would matter. The clubhouse was nearly full when I walked in carrying a leather binder containing engineering reports, county approvals, soil analyses, drainage calculations, and every signed permit associated with the project. Brenda Holloway welcomed everyone with the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to controlling the room. When my property appeared on the projector screen behind her, several people leaned forward with curious expressions. Then the first photograph of my flood wall filled the screen. A few quiet chuckles spread across the audience. Brenda smiled before speaking. She said the board had received multiple concerns about an unnecessary concrete structure that negatively affected neighborhood appearance and could potentially reduce surrounding property values. She never mentioned safety. She never mentioned drainage. She only talked about appearances. When it was my turn, I stood and calmly explained why the wall existed. I described the elevation differences across the subdivision. I showed historical rainfall data. I pointed to county flood maps and demonstrated how runoff naturally collected in the lower section of the development during major storms. I explained that the barrier redirected water toward an approved overflow route rather than trapping it. I kept my voice steady because I believed information deserved patience. Some homeowners listened carefully. Others looked bored after the first few minutes. Then one board member laughed and asked if I expected our quiet neighborhood to turn into the Mississippi River. Several people laughed with him. Brenda thanked me for my presentation before reminding everyone that communities depended on shared standards and visual harmony. Someone suggested planting climbing vines over the wall so it would disappear. Another neighbor joked that perhaps I should have built a castle to match it. The room filled with light-hearted laughter, and I simply closed my binder without responding. Walking back to my seat, I realized something important. They were not rejecting my engineering. They were rejecting the possibility that preparation could ever be more valuable than appearance. 2 days later, I received my first official violation notice along with a $100 fine for maintaining an unapproved exterior modification despite the county permits already on file. I immediately submitted copies of every approval to the HOA office. They acknowledged receiving the documents, but informed me that county compliance did not automatically satisfy community design standards. Over the following weeks, more notices appeared. More fines accumulated. Neighbors who had once waved while walking their dogs now slowed down just long enough to glance at the wall before continuing their conversations. I never argued across the fence. Every evening after work, I simply inspected the drainage outlets, checked the expansion joints, and made notes in a small weatherproof notebook. They believed I was protecting a piece of concrete. The truth was that I was protecting something far more important, although none of us knew how soon that difference would matter. The fines kept arriving with almost perfect timing, usually every Friday afternoon, as though someone wanted my weekends to begin with another reminder that I did not quite belong. I paid none of them. Instead, I documented every notice, scanned every envelope, and filed every letter beside the engineering reports that had already filled an entire drawer in my home office. Experience had taught me that disagreements fade, but paperwork lasts forever. About 3 weeks after the first violation, I received a certified letter from the association's attorney requesting immediate compliance with community architectural standards. The language sounded intimidating at first glance, filled with references to governing documents and enforcement authority, but buried beneath the formal wording was one detail they could not escape. They never claimed my wall violated county law because it did not. They only argued that it conflicted with neighborhood appearance guidelines. That distinction mattered more than they realized. The following Monday, I scheduled a meeting with the county engineering department. I carried the same leather binder that had become almost an extension of my arm. A senior plan reviewer welcomed me into his office, spread my construction drawings across a large table, and spent nearly 40 minutes reviewing every page. When he finally leaned back in his chair, he smiled and said something I had expected all along. Every permit had been properly issued. Every inspection had passed. Every setback requirement had been met. He even pointed out that the drainage improvements incorporated into my project slightly reduced runoff velocity leaving my property during major storm events. Before I left, I requested certified copies of every approval along with inspection records and official correspondence confirming compliance. I was not preparing for an argument anymore. I was preparing for history. A few days later, another HOA meeting was held. This time I spoke for less than 5 minutes. I handed each board member a complete packet containing county certifications, engineering summaries, and signed inspection reports. Brenda accepted the documents politely, thanked me, and announced that the board would review them with legal counsel. I thought perhaps reason had finally entered the conversation. Instead, 2 weeks later I received another violation notice, another fine, and another demand that I modify the appearance of the wall through decorative treatments that would interfere with the drainage features specifically approved by the county. That was the moment I stopped expecting common ground. From then on, every interaction became strictly professional. I answered every letter in writing. I saved every electronic message. I photographed my property every Sunday morning from the same locations so there would never be any dispute about its condition. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood continued almost normally. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks after school. Families grilled hamburgers on weekends. Delivery trucks rolled through the subdivision every afternoon. The wall slowly became just another feature people passed without much thought, although I occasionally noticed someone pointing toward it while talking with a neighbor. Summer settled comfortably over Maple Ridge estates, bringing bright afternoons, neatly trimmed lawns, and the comforting illusion that beautiful weather could last forever. Then, during the second week of August, I opened the latest regional climate outlook while drinking coffee before sunrise. The forecast discussed unusually warm ocean temperatures, saturated upstream watersheds, and the increasing probability of a slow-moving storm system capable of producing historic rainfall across our county. I read every line twice before quietly printing the report. Outside, The neighborhood looked peaceful beneath the early morning light. Birds sang from the oak trees, sprinklers clicked across green lawns, and not a single person appeared worried. I folded the forecast, placed it inside my binder beside every permit and every violation notice, and for the first time since moving into Maple Ridge Estates, I began preparing for something I sincerely hoped would never happen. The weather forecast became more serious with each passing day. What had started as a broad discussion about above-average rainfall slowly transformed into increasingly specific warnings from meteorologists who rarely sounded concerned unless they had good reason. Rainfall projections climbed from 3 inches to 6, then 8, and finally into numbers that caused me to stop reading headlines and start studying hourly precipitation models instead. I had seen this pattern before on projects across the Midwest. Storms did not become dangerous because people ignored the final warning. They became dangerous because people dismissed every warning that came before it. My preparation was quiet enough that most neighbors probably assumed I was simply doing routine yard work. Early one Saturday morning, while the air still carried the fresh scent of cut grass and damp soil, I walked the entire length of my flood barrier with a flashlight and inspection notebook. I checked every expansion joint for movement, removed leaves from each drainage opening, tested the emergency spillway gate, and verified that the pressure relief channels remained completely clear. Beneath a removable utility cover hidden by landscaping, I inspected the backup pump system, confirmed the battery reserve was fully charged, and started the generator long enough to ensure it responded without hesitation. The familiar steady hum echoed softly through the compartment before I shut everything down again. Machines deserved exercise just as much as people did. Later that afternoon, I drove to the hardware store and quietly replaced supplies I hoped would never become necessary. Fresh fuel, flashlights, extra batteries, work gloves, sandbags, waterproof tarps. Not because I expected catastrophe, but because preparation is always less expensive than regret. On my way home, I noticed colorful banners hanging outside the Maple Ridge Clubhouse announcing the annual Summer Family Festival. Food trucks were scheduled. Live music had been booked. Children would have inflatable games, and the community pool planned an evening celebration. The neighborhood social media page overflowed with cheerful comments about sunshine, barbecue recipes, and lawn decorating contests. Buried beneath dozens of those conversations was a single shared weather advisory from the county emergency management office. It received almost no attention. 2 days later, I was trimming shrubs along the inside edge of the wall when Brenda walked past with another board member. They slowed just enough for me to hear part of their conversation. She glanced toward the concrete barrier and smiled before saying that if I spent half as much energy making my property beautiful as I spent worrying about imaginary floods, the neighborhood might actually thank me someday. They both laughed politely before continuing down the sidewalk. I simply nodded, returned to my work, and kept clearing the drainage channel hidden beneath the decorative stone border. The forecast updated again that evening. A slow-moving storm system had shifted slightly, placing our county closer to the center of the projected rainfall corridor. Emergency management encouraged residents to clean storm drains, secure outdoor furniture, and avoid unnecessary travel if heavy rain developed. The recommendations were straightforward, practical, and easy to follow. Yet as I drove through the subdivision the following afternoon, I noticed freshly delivered mulch piled near curb inlets, landscaping crews blowing grass clippings toward street gutters, and decorative planters sitting directly over several drainage grates because they looked attractive near the sidewalks. None of those choices seemed important on a sunny day. Together, they quietly reduced the neighborhood's ability to move water where it needed to go. On the evening before the first rain bands were expected to arrive, I stood beside my flood wall as the wind carried the distant smell of approaching rain across the valley. Above me, thick gray clouds slowly erased the last patches of blue sky. The neighborhood still looked calm, comfortable, and completely confident. Nature, however, had already begun keeping its own schedule. The rain arrived just before dawn as a steady whisper against the roof, the kind of gentle rainfall that convinces people every forecast was exaggerated. I brewed a pot of coffee, opened the weather radar on my tablet, and watched an enormous band of deep red and orange stretch across 3 counties with almost no movement at all. By 7 o'clock, the whisper had become a constant roar. Water streamed along every curb in Maple Ridge estates, carrying tiny leaves, grass clippings, and bits of mulch toward the nearest storm drains. At first, everything behaved exactly as the original drainage models predicted. The streets collected runoff, the inlets accepted it, and the system continued pushing water toward the eastern discharge channel. Then the second wave of rain arrived. It fell harder than the first, drumming against windows with a rhythm so intense it blurred the view beyond the glass. I stepped outside beneath the covered porch and immediately smelled wet earth mixed with fresh asphalt as water rushed downhill from the higher sections of the subdivision. My rain gauge climbed past 3 inches before mid-morning. The county alert on my phone announced flash flood warnings for low-lying neighborhoods, advising residents to stay indoors and avoid driving through standing water. Looking down the street, I noticed something subtle that most people would never recognize. The nearest storm drain was no longer swallowing water as quickly as it should have been. Instead of forming a shallow funnel toward the grate, runoff was beginning to spread sideways across the pavement. I walked closer under an umbrella and saw exactly what I had feared. Wet mulch, trimmed grass, small branches, and decorative landscape stone had formed a dense mat across the opening. Water continued arriving faster than it could escape. Within another 30 minutes, the first intersection developed a broad sheet of standing water stretching from curb to curb. Across the neighborhood, garage doors remained closed. Because everyone assumed the storm would soon pass. It did not. Radar showed another massive cell approaching directly behind the first. By early afternoon, nearly 8 inches of rain had fallen. The retention pond near the clubhouse reached its normal high water mark, then quietly exceeded it. The overflow pipe discharged continuously, but the incoming flow was simply too great. Water spilled over the grassy banks and began moving across the common area exactly where old topographic maps had predicted decades earlier. I climbed onto the inside maintenance walkway along my flood wall and watched runoff surge toward the barrier in muddy waves carrying twigs, pine needles, and floating flower beds torn loose from neighborhood landscaping. The wall accepted the impact without complaint, redirecting the current toward the engineered overflow channel exactly as it had been designed to do. Meanwhile, beyond my property line, the subdivision slowly transformed into something almost unrecognizable. Basketball hoops reflected in water-covering driveways. Mailboxes stood like lonely markers rising from shallow pools. Parked sport utility vehicles and pickup trucks sat with water creeping higher around their tires every hour. Then the electrical warning sirens from the county echoed faintly through the rain. Moments later, another emergency alert flashed across my phone. Historic rainfall totals had overwhelmed multiple drainage systems throughout the region. Residents were urged to seek higher ground if flooding threatened their homes. I looked toward the clubhouse through the curtain of rain and noticed people beginning to step outside, staring in disbelief at streets they had driven every day now disappearing beneath moving water. The storm had stopped looking like bad weather. It had become an engineering problem, and the neighborhood had just realized it far too late. By late afternoon, the rain had become almost impossible to separate from the sound of rushing water. It surrounded the neighborhood with a steady roar that drowned out lawn sprinklers, barking dogs, and every ordinary noise that usually defined Maple Ridge estates. Standing behind my flood wall, I watched the water level rise another several inches before stabilizing against the reinforced concrete. The pressure increased exactly as my calculations had predicted, and the barrier quietly redirected the current toward the emergency overflow channel running along the edge of my property. Everything on my side continued functioning exactly as it had been designed years before a single drop of this storm ever fell. Then I heard the pounding at my front door. When I opened it, Brenda Holloway stood there soaked from head to toe, breathing heavily as rainwater dripped from her sleeves onto the porch. Gone was the confident smile she wore at every board meeting. Gone was the polished voice that once lectured homeowners about neighborhood appearance. She looked exhausted, frightened, and completely overwhelmed. Behind her stood several neighbors, including 2 men who had laughed during my engineering presentation months earlier. Nobody was smiling now. Brenda struggled to find the right words before finally saying, "Ethan, we need your help. The retention pond overflowed. The eastern drainage channel is backing up. Water is spreading through the lower streets faster than anyone expected." I looked past them toward the neighborhood entrance where muddy water continued flowing across the pavement in broad moving sheets. She followed my eyes before speaking again, this time much more quietly. The county emergency manager said you might understand how to redirect the flow. For just a moment, nobody said anything. Rain struck the porch roof while distant thunder rolled across the valley. I could have reminded everyone about every violation notice. I could have mentioned every fine, every sarcastic comment, every meeting where facts were dismissed in favor of appearances. None of those thoughts mattered anymore. Floodwater never asks who was right yesterday. It only asks who is prepared today. I grabbed my waterproof jacket, emergency radio, and the laminated drainage maps I had kept inside my office ever since moving into the neighborhood. As we walked toward the flood wall, several homeowners stared at it with entirely different expressions than they had only weeks before. They no longer saw an eyesore. They saw a structure still standing exactly where everything else had begun to fail. I unlocked the concealed maintenance access panel built into the landscaping and exposed the emergency spillway controls beneath it. One neighbor looked surprised and quietly admitted he had never realized that section even existed. I explained that the wall had never been intended to trap water indefinitely. Its purpose was to control direction, reduce pressure, and release excess flow gradually before dangerous accumulation could occur. Working carefully, I adjusted the spillway gate a few inches at a time while monitoring water levels along both sides of the barrier. Almost immediately, part of the backed-up runoff began entering the engineered overflow channel instead of spreading randomly across nearby yards. The change was not dramatic enough to stop the storm, but it slowed the rising water where several homes had been most vulnerable. At the same time, I started the backup pump system to assist drainage through the approved discharge route. The steady mechanical hum blended into the sound of falling rain as water slowly began moving with purpose instead of chaos. Brenda stood silently beside me watching the system work. Finally, she looked at the wall, then back at me, and said something I never expected to hear. "We should have listened when you tried to explain it." The rain finally weakened sometime before sunrise, leaving behind an unfamiliar silence broken only by generators humming in the distance and the steady sound of water draining through channels that had been overwhelmed only hours earlier. Low clouds still hung over Maple Ridge Estates, and the entire neighborhood carried the earthy smell of soaked mulch, wet lumber, and fresh mud. I spent the first light of morning walking the streets with county emergency personnel, helping identify blocked drainage paths and checking which roads could safely reopen. Water was already receding from many of the homes nearest my property because the controlled overflow route had continued working through the night. Other sections of the subdivision were not as fortunate. Several garages had taken on water, landscaped common areas had been heavily eroded, and the retention pond overflow had carved deep channels across portions of the shared green space. By mid-morning, county engineers arrived with survey equipment, drones, and inspection crews. They were not there to determine whether a storm had occurred. They were there to understand why one neighborhood had experienced damage that seemed far worse than surrounding communities receiving nearly identical rainfall totals. I recognized several of the engineers from projects we had worked on years before. Professional conversations replaced emotional opinions almost immediately. Elevations were measured. Drainage structures were opened. Flow directions were mapped. Within a few hours, one pattern became impossible to ignore. Multiple storm drain inlets had been partially obstructed by decorative landscaping installed over the past several years. In several locations, common area grading no longer matched the original approved construction plans. Soil and decorative stone had gradually reduced drainage capacity, while landscaping modifications had redirected runoff into areas never intended to receive concentrated flow. One engineer quietly compared the original subdivision drawings with current field conditions before shaking his head. The changes looked attractive, but they had slowly altered how water moved through the neighborhood. During ordinary storms, nobody noticed. During an extraordinary storm, every small decision added together. Later that afternoon, the county requested copies of my engineering permits and drainage calculations. I handed over the same binder that had followed me from one HOA meeting to the next. This time, however, nobody laughed when they opened it. The inspection supervisor carefully reviewed the documents before telling Brenda that my flood barrier had fully complied with county requirements from the beginning and had likely reduced downstream damage by controlling runoff velocity along my property line. Standing nearby, I noticed several board members avoiding eye contact with one another. The conversation no longer centered on appearances or architectural harmony. It centered on maintenance records, engineering standards, inspection history, and whether previous recommendations for drainage improvements had ever been completed. Over the following weeks, insurance adjusters, engineers, and county officials continued their evaluations. The association's board meetings changed completely. Discussions about landscaping colors and decorative fencing gave way to conversations about culvert capacity, maintenance schedules, emergency planning, and infrastructure funding. Several homeowners who had once questioned my decisions stopped by simply to thank me for helping during the storm. Brenda visited one afternoon carrying a folder instead of another violation notice. She quietly informed me that every outstanding fine related to the flood wall had been withdrawn and formally removed from the association records. She also apologized, not with rehearsed words prepared for a meeting, but with the calm honesty of someone who had finally allowed evidence to speak louder than assumptions. I accepted her apology because resentment never improves drainage, repairs neighborhoods, or prepares communities for the next storm. Good engineering does. 6 months later, the neighborhood looked almost the same to anyone driving through for the first time, but I noticed hundreds of small differences that most people would never see. New drainage grates had replaced older undersized ones along the eastern streets. The retention pond had been expanded and reshaped according to updated engineering recommendations. Maintenance schedules were posted publicly instead of buried inside meeting minutes. Landscaping crews no longer piled mulch near storm drains, and every autumn volunteer spent a Saturday clearing leaves from drainage channels before the rainy season arrived. The association even established an infrastructure committee made up of homeowners with engineering, construction, and emergency management experience, so future decisions would begin with facts instead of assumptions. I accepted an invitation to attend one of those meetings, not as someone seeking recognition, but simply to answer technical questions whenever they arose. Brenda opened the session by placing a thick binder on the conference table. I recognized it immediately. It was the same packet of engineering reports I had handed to the board months before, the one that had barely been acknowledged. This time she thanked everyone for reviewing it carefully before any vote concerning future neighborhood improvements. I smiled quietly because nothing inside those pages had changed. Only the willingness to listen had. On my walk home that evening, I passed the section of sidewalk overlooking my property where several neighbors had gathered. Children rode bicycles through puddles left behind by a light afternoon shower while their parents talked about installing rain gardens and improving drainage around their own homes. One of the neighbors who had joked about my wall during that first meeting walked over and admitted he had recently added proper grading around his backyard after learning more about stormwater flow. He laughed at himself before saying that he used to think drainage was boring until he understood what happened when it failed. We both agreed that the best infrastructure is the kind people never have to notice because it quietly does its job every single day. My flood wall remained exactly where it had always stood, its concrete now weathered slightly by sun and rain, with young maple trees casting longer shadows across the inside edge than they had the year before. Sometimes visitors asked why it curved so gently instead of running in a perfectly straight line. I would point toward the natural slope of the land and explain that good engineering works with nature instead of trying to defeat it. The curve was never about appearance. It was about guiding water where it already wanted to go. Every so often I still opened the maintenance panel, inspected the spillway controls, tested the backup pump, and recorded another entry in the same weatherproof notebook I had carried since moving into Maple Ridge Estates. Most inspections ended exactly the way I hoped they would, with nothing unusual to report. That was always the goal. Success in engineering is often measured by the disasters that never happen. Looking across the neighborhood on quiet evenings, it was difficult to imagine the streets once covered by rushing water or the fear that had filled the air during that long night. Memories fade, lawns recover, and fresh paint eventually hides old water lines. But the lessons remain if people choose to remember them. I never wanted to win an argument with the homeowners association. I wanted everyone to understand that preparation is never an act of fear. It is an act of respect for reality. Water does not care about popularity, opinions, or appearances. It follows gravity with perfect honesty every single time. And in the end, the strongest foundation any community can build is not concrete alone, but the willingness to respect knowledge before nature demands that lesson the hard way.